Hello and welcome to the History of Bangalore. I am Ramjee Chandran with episode 52. This is the final episode of season 1. This season finale is a wrap-up of everything that happened in the centuries that led up to the founding of the modern city of Bengaluru by Hiria Kempe Gowda. And all this happened during the time of Vijayanagara Emperor Achyuta. So let's dive into it and find out what happened. But before that, first, as always, a word of thanks to my sponsors, the Prestige Group. Their corporate support is the reason I'm able to bring you this podcast. Building cities, one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. So here we are in the early 16th century. It is the year 1509, and Krishna Deva Raya of the Tuluva dynasty, which is the third dynasty in the Vijayanagara line, is on the throne. Krishna Deva had inherited a glorious kingdom, glorious in many ways. Not only was the land wealthy from the harvest and all the trade, but it was rich culturally. Even today, Hampi is its showcase. And in Hampi, the Virupaksha temple is a standing testament to its history. Note that this temple predates Vijayanagara. Inscriptions suggest that it was a sacred site as early as the 7th century, and that would be during the time of the early Chalukyas. Later the Hoysalas and then the Vijayanagara kings have added to its glory right up to the 15th and 16th century. For example, it was Krishna Deva who commissioned that towering eastern Gopura and the Kalyana Mandapa, or the Grand Pillared Hall. The Virupaksha temple is to be seen as an example of how all empires of the Deccan respected and supported culture in a secular way. From the support they gave the hundreds of such shrines across the massive southern peninsula, no matter what their personal faith was, they encouraged everyone and everything. In many ways, Vijayanagara should be seen as being the final repository of the rich culture of the south. The reason I don't delve more into the fascinating architecture of the area is simply because I'm not competent to. I have a lot of information, but very little knowledge. Happily, there's a trove of books on the subject, and I read everything I can find on it. And if you're joining me in this enterprise, look for books by George Mitchell. Those are wonderful. Hampi has inspired art and architecture, scholars and historians right from the 19th century, and before them, travelers who looked upon Vijayanagara with awe. And these included people like Abdur Razak, about whom we have spoken a lot in previous episodes, but also a number of visiting Europeans like Niccolo dai Conti. And then most significant to Vijayanagara history were the accounts of two Portuguese gentlemen, Domingo Pais and Fernão Nunes. The accounts of these writers form the bulk of the content of the first book about Vijayanagara, authored by Robert Sewell in 1900. The political situation in the time of Krishna Deva Raya's ascendancy was as fluid as ever, but there were some notable developments. Far away in Delhi, the Sultanate was now in the hands of Afghan rulers, the Lodis, and it was approaching its last days. Towards the beginning of the 16th century, that's the early 1500s where we are now, Sikandar Lodi was on the throne. And there is a rather interesting aside about the ascendancy of this Sultan. When his father, Bahlul Lodi, died, Sikandar's mother, who was only a goldsmith's daughter, but said to be of such beauty that she was, and I quote, elevated to the Sultan's bed. She addressed the assembly of nobles from behind a parda or curtain, as was the culture of the time, and she made a case for her son Sikandar to get the throne. Sikandar was crowned Sultan eventually, but not before one of the nobles, Isa Khan, a nephew of the dead Sultan and therefore cousin of Sikandar Lodi, remarked famously, "What business have goldsmiths' grandsons with the reign of government? Especially since it's proverbial that monkeys make but bad carpenters." Stung. But that little tale is important for the reason that it suggests that voices were being raised in the courts of the Sultan in the matter of succession. And that in turn is significant because that state of affairs was creeping into all the other strongholds of the areas held at one time or the other by the Sultanate from Delhi in the Deccan, but they were now turning independent. The Madurai Sultanate that killed Veera Ballala III was one such. Another was the Bahmani Sultanate that came into being after a revolt against Muhammad bin Tughlaq in 1347, and 200 years later remained a thorn in the side of the Vijayanagara kings. Many battles raged between them. One of the most significant battles between the Vijayanagara and the Bahmani kingdoms, a watershed moment in the history of warfare, was the Battle of Adoni in 1368 AD. This battle between Bukka and Muhammad Shah featured the first known use of gunpowder in the Indian subcontinent. The gunners, however, were soldiers of fortune or mercenaries, probably Ottoman Turks. The scholar Firishta tells us that this was the first time that guns had been used in battle in the subcontinent, but it's not hard to imagine that by then knowledge of gunpowder warfare had already reached southern India. Gunpowder had been in active use in China for centuries before, and gunpowder found its way into the subcontinent quite easily through the many trade routes that existed. And then, Ismail Faraj, the king of Granada, was using artillery in the siege of Baza in 1325, and by 1326, foundries in Florence were already making brass cannons using iron balls as ordnance. Given the volume of trade that existed and diplomatic missions that existed between Europe and India, it's nothing much to consider that those weapons would have found their way into the army of Vijayanagara. Now, Firishta also mentions Europeans and Ottoman Turks serving with the artillery, but exactly who were they? The Portuguese wouldn't arrive in India for another 130 years in any military sense. So it's possible that some Europeans from the Eastern Roman Empire or Venice had made their way to India, probably through Egypt and the Red Sea, or even overland. Some might have been independent adventurers, while others could have come as slaves of the merchants. That existed at that point too. Either way, both Europeans and Ottoman Turks would have become highly sought after as gunners and artillery experts on hire by any army that could pay their wages. The Battle of Adoni would have been towards the end of Bukka's reign, and it would have been a matter of grave concern and curiosity for his successor, Harihara II, because after this time, descriptions of battles regularly included guns and cannons. By the time Krishna Deva had ascended the throne, the Bahmani kingdom was tottering unsteadily. Its gradual fragmentation into 5 independent Deccan Sultanates, Bijapur, Ahmednagar, Golconda, Bidar and Berar, had already begun. Of these, the Bijapur Sultanate had already declared independence in 1490 under Yusuf Adil, its founder. In only a few decades, the Bijapur Sultanate would become the cause of the downfall and the destruction of the Vijayanagara kingdom. Much of the arc of Krishna Deva's reign saw a series of battles. He went everywhere, across the Deccan and as far away as Orissa and Kalinga. And that was a campaign that was deemed to be brilliant in terms of military strategy. He defeated Prataparudra, then married his daughter, and then he returned the kingdom to his new father-in-law. It was around 1515 when the power of the Vijayanagara kingdom was past compare. It was at its peak, and by this time, Krishna Deva was unstoppable. But, as is bound to happen with warriors who are victorious in battle, his sense of success and power had started to border on arrogance, and this led to the famous episode against Adil Shah of Bijapur. Now, when he was busy with the Orissa campaign, Adil Shah of the Bijapur Sultanate, by the way, all the Bijapur Sultans took the name Adil Shah, and you could only tell them apart by their first names. So this was Ismail Adil Shah. Anyway, in what was an overly optimistic move, Ismail Adil Shah of Bijapur captured Raichur. Now this region, known as the Raichur Doab because it lay between the Krishna and Tungabhadra rivers, was highly prized for its strategic importance and agricultural wealth. Control over Raichur meant not just access to fertile lands, but also dominance over key trade routes of the Deccan. Upon his return, and by the descriptions of Hernão and Nunez, Krishna Deva was upset by this. He assembled a force of 1 million men and marched to liberate Raichur. In his army were several Portuguese marksmen who, with their rifles, picked off the sentries on the fort and opened the ground for the infantry to liberate it. Sometimes after battles, the defeated territories are handed back to the losers, maybe after taking some booty of war or some other diplomatic move. But Krishna Deva's victory over Adil Shah made him bold, some might say arrogant. He kept the defeated ruler's ambassador waiting for 1 month, and then he sent word that he'd return the lost territories only if Adil Shah came and kissed his foot. This show of strength and arrogance alarmed the Deccan Sultans, and they saw Vijayanagara as more than a growing threat. They decided that Krishna Deva had to be stopped. The Portuguese, meanwhile, thrived on the coast in Goa, and their fortunes were tied to Vijayanagara's support because of all the trade that was happening through that port. And then another time in 1523, a crafty diplomat from Ismail Adil Shah again, from his court, lured Krishna Deva into accepting another challenge from Adil Shah. But when Krishna Deva arrived at the appointed battlefield, he found no enemy. He had been fooled. Understandably upset again, Krishna Deva stormed Gulbarga. He occupied Bijapur and freed the 3 sons of Mahmud II Bahmani, who had been imprisoned by Adil Shah after the Sultanates had overthrown the Bhavani kingdom. He then installed the eldest of the sons as Sultan and took the other 2 back to Vijayanagara. But this move to revive the Bahmani dynasty under Vijayanagara patronage only deepened the Deccan Sultans' hostility against him and pushed them closer to an alliance against the Vijayanagara Empire. And this did not augur well for them at all. And then on 17th October 1529, Krishna Deva Raya died. And now for a well-deserved commercial break, and when I come back in only 30 seconds, I will get into the reign of Raya and the rise of Kempe Gowda I, the founder of Bengaluru. Right after this. Hi, I'm back. After Krishna Deva died, the throne passed on to Raya, his younger sibling. By this time, Vijayanagara's problems with the Bijapur Sultanate, caused by a terrible mix of ambition, arrogance and ego, were intractable. This was only going to end in one way. One of them had to fall, and the countdown to doomsday had begun. Right from the start of his reign, Achyuta was looking over his shoulder, nervously, for one, at the claim of Krishna Deva's son-in-law, Ramaraya. Meanwhile, with Krishna Deva out of the way, Bijapur's Adil Shah recaptured the strategic Raichur Doab. He forced Achyuta into 1 series of battles and 2 series of diplomatic moves, and none of these were savory alliances between Bijapur and Vijayanagara, and it would end in nothing but more trouble, given that hatred and distrust were the basis for their relationship. As we have seen in the last 52 episodes of this podcast, the weakening of an empire sends a signal through rank, file, allies and vassals that they had better watch out for themselves. It never happens all at once. It's easy to picture the scene. Small rumblings start, gossip and then rumor, and then a general feeling of unease, and all of this often develops into open rebellion. And when things fall apart and the center cannot hold, anarchy, open rebellion, palace coups, open challenges, then battles, and then an implosion leading to the birth of other kingdoms. By the mid-1500s, the Vijayanagara kingdom had entered such a phase. And of the many principalities and vassals that had started to sniff an opportunity, there are 2 that matter deeply to the history of Bangalore. One was the Wadiyars, rulers of the Mysore region and vassals of the Vijayanagara kingdom, and the other, a Palegar in charge of a small principality called Yalahanka, and this was Kempe Gowda I. In 1399, in the time of the reign of Harihara II in Vijayanagara, a local Palegar came to take over the small and barely significant territory of Mysore. Now, the word polygar can mean different things depending on where and when it is used. In essence, the word means a local leader or chieftain, but sometimes the term also referred to revenue officers who are responsible for collecting taxes. Depending on the place and time, a polygar could be a feudal lord, a military commander, a tax collector, or even a rebel warlord. Back in the Vijayanagara time, a polygar was a local chieftain, a military leader, a garrison commander who controlled fortified territories. And this is the definition relevant to us for the present story. After Vijayanagara's fall, many polygars broke away. They turned into independent warlords, little kingdoms. They resisted not just the Delhi sultans but later also the Mysore rulers and even the British in later years. The name of the polygar first identifiable as the beginning of the Wadiyar dynasty is Yaduraya. Now, the origin story of the Wadiyars, like a number of others, has unverifiable references to mythology, but there is a more recent story of valor that made it to the accounts of history. And this version is from a book by Mark Wilkes, one of the best-known chroniclers of Bangalore. It is the story of two young men, Vijaya and Krishna, who set out from their home in the Vijayanagara court and went looking for better prospects somewhere else in the south. Their journey brought them to a small fort called Hadana, present-day Hadinaru. It's about 25 kilometers southeast of Mysore. Now, as was the custom of the time, they stopped by a tank to get some water and to rest when they overheard a group of women from the Jangam sect community who were fetching water, but they were lamenting the fate of a young maiden from their tribe. Jangam seems to be a variation of Jangama, which refers to the wandering ascetics of the Lingayat or the Veerashaiva tradition. That term, Jangama, is often used interchangeably with Lingayat in historical texts, especially in colonial era records and in translations, of course. Anyway, they were lamenting the fate of this young maiden from their tribe. So curious, the brothers asked them what they were talking about, what happened. The women explained to them that the girl they were talking about, the daughter of a local Wadiyar who ruled over 33 villages, was being forced to marry a man of a lower status. Now, the father of the girl was suffering from a mental illness, and this left her vulnerable. And the chief of the village of Karugahalli, who was a man of humble birth, had given the family two choices: either accept the alliance of marriage and surrender Hadinaru to him peacefully, or face war. Left with no real choice, they reluctantly agreed to the marriage. But the girl was unhappy. She was miserable. When they heard the story, Vijaya and Krishna assured those women that they would protect the girl. Their offer of chivalry reached the family, and then they were invited in to discuss a plan. Now, following their plan, the wedding feast went ahead. But as the Karugahalli chief and his men sat down to eat, the brothers, along with their hidden allies from Hadinaru, sprang out. They ambushed their guests, killed them on the spot, and immediately marched on Karugahalli and took the town by surprise. Grateful for her rescue, the young woman willingly married Vijaya, and he changed his religion from being a Vaishnava to a Lingayat, and he became the ruler of Hadinaru and Karugahalli and all the territories that his father-in-law had held. And by this origin story, Vijaya was Vijayaraja or Yaduraya, the first of the Wadiyars. In another and less romantic record, Vijayanagara Emperor Harihara II installed Vijayaraja as his vassal in Mysore with a mandate to keep the Dalavais, or members of the royal guard or warrior contingent, in check. Well, whatever be the story, the Wadiyars have ruled Mysore area from 1399 until the present day. That's over 600 years. As for the other person, the origin story of Kempe Gowda also began in 1399, and this story too has a damsel who needed to be rescued from a polygar who had gone ahead and made wedding plans. Now, I urge you to listen to the very first episode of this podcast. It's titled How Kempe Gowda's Ancestors Came to Bangalore. It happens to be one of the 5 most listened to episodes in this series, so I promise you, you won't be disappointed. But in short, it is the story of a group of farmers, 7 brothers of the Morasu Vokkaliga community who had been based in Alur near Kanchipuram. when they had faced up with this Palegar who was making their life hell, they left their home and generations of their life behind. They had decided that seeking a future in the Vijayanagara kingdom was better than staying back and fighting the Palegar endlessly. So getting on bullock carts, they left the village on the cover of night, and after a harrowing escape from the Palegar and his henchmen, they reached Kolar, and then they made their way to Avani near Nandidurga. Later, the brothers split up and settled in various parts of the Vijayanagara kingdom. But important to our story was the patriarch of the Morosu Vakkalu, who established himself in Yelahanka. He was Jaya Gowda, the grandfather of the man who would be the founder of Bengaluru, Kempe Gowda I. Years passed, and by our present time, in the reign of Asha Thadani in the early 1500s, the fifth of the Wadiyar dynasty, Chamaraja Wadiyar III, was on the throne of Mysore. He would be the last vassal of the Vijayanagara kingdom. His successor, Timmaraja Wadiyar II, would declare independence and create the sovereign Wadiyar dynasty. In Yelahanka, the local chieftain, or the Nada Prabhu, was starting to get restless. This was Kempe Gowda, and he was ambitious, and he saw a great commercial opportunity right there in his neighborhood. Now it was commerce that drove the region, Yelahanka, and every other small village and principality that had long, for centuries, been on the wealthy trade routes of the Deccan. Their region was starting to grow, with new settlers coming in, making this area their home and contributing to the wealth of the region. The revenue for Kempe Gowda would have been so good that it would have fueled his ambitions. He could see the future in building a new city. His vision, actually, was a grand marketplace, one that would attract traders from everywhere. They would set up shop and home in a dedicated area that he would build. This would be of great convenience for the many traveling merchants traversing the land, moving between east and west coasts on the routes that had existed for centuries. The place he picked was close enough to the traditional junctions of trade route, the Kudalus, like Begur, like Hebbal, like many others. He envisioned that he would build a place for them where all the merchants could come together in one place, and therefore all the buyers would also reach that same location. And by this, he would collect rents and octroi. This was the early definition of a mall, if you think about it. And then Kempe Gowda would protect them by building a fort that would give them the protection of the state. And with this in view, he applied to his overlord Asha Raya for permission to build this fort. And in 1537, the fort and the pete, the dreams of Kempe Gowda, were realized. And this fort, built over, modified, breached, destroyed, and rebuilt, and then taken apart, stands today in the modern city of Bangalore. And thus, Bangalore was born. Okay, folks, this is a wrap of Season 1, The Early History. It has been so much fun to track the history of everything to do with the region. I started the story from 350 AD with the Kadambas and the Gangas, leading right up to where we are in the 16th century. I will take a break for about a month, if I can keep away for that long. In this time, I will prepare for Season 2, the years from Kempe Gowda to the fall of Tipu Sultan, and tomorrow morning, I put pen to paper to start writing the book, The History of Bangalore. Please make sure that you have asked your podcast host to alert you when the next episode comes alive. And until I return, be good. I am Ramjee Chandran, and this is the History of Bangalore.